Welcome to our web development class. In this class, we will cover Chapter 8 and look at some of the nice contributions that HTML5 and CSS3 have given us for forms. HTML5, in addition to giving us new custom structural elements, has also implemented several what are called APIs, Application Programming Interfaces, and we saw that with the HTML5 video. We also have a lot of interactivity now with our form elements that were traditionally accomplished using JavaScript. They can now be accomplished using HTML5. So let's take a look at some of these nice features. Here we are looking at what is the placeholder attribute. And this is an HTML attribute, and this can be placed into the text box. The value assigned to this attribute will be the grayed out information displayed in the text box. So it gives us a nice way of indicating to the user the nature of the content that they should be typing in without adding additional content around that box. However, if you look in the HTML code, we still see the label attribute, the label element, which is used to indicate that this caption is related to that text box. And even if we don't want to display it, we can use CSS to hide it, and it should still be included for purposes of accessibility. We also have the autofocus attribute. And many times when you load a form or when you go to a page to log on, you see this blinking cursor. That is called focus, and in HTML5 it is the autofocus attribute. You can only give focus to one box, period, on the form. So generally you would use the autofocus attribute in the first text box of the form. We also have the autocomplete attribute. Now, by default, browsers generally remember things and try to help you with the autocomplete feature. However, what HTML5 allows us to do is to turn that feature off. So if we didn't want that default browser feature, we can use the autocomplete attribute, and we can set the value to off, and that will essentially disable it. One thing that we commonly do with HTML forms is to indicate to the user that certain fields are required. And if they do not fill in those required fields, we traditionally have used JavaScript to give them a message. Now we can use the required attribute to accomplish this. It is a one-sided attribute, and it would be placed inside the form element that should be required. Should the user try to submit the form without filling in the required field, a message to the user would be displayed, and that form would not be able to be submitted until the user did enter the required information. We also have the Datalist element, and this is a little bit more involved. It requires the input text box, and in that text box we would have a list attribute set to a value, and that value would match the ID value of the data list element. Inside the data list element we have the option element set to values, and what this enables us to do, it enables us to start typing in the text box. And two things can happen. An arrow would be displayed on the right to indicate that we can click that arrow and to display a drop-down field of our choices. However, if we started to type, based on the letters that we were typing, it would be able to find the matches of those letters quickly. So for a very long drop-down list, it would be easy to find things by starting to type in the values. Here again, this is traditionally accomplished using JavaScript. We can do that now with this HTML5 element. All right, another thing that we always have done using JavaScript in the past is to make sure that when we're asking the user to enter an email address, that it is a valid email address. So here in HTML5, we have type equals email. And what will happen is if the user does not enter a valid email address, the browser will give them an error message here, and the form will not be able to be submitted until they do enter that valid address. Another new HTML5 element is the number, and that is implemented using type equals number. And that gives us these little spinner arrows on the right and allows us to code in a number by pressing on the arrow keys. We can also set a range of numbers. Another new element is the type equals URL. Similar to type equals email, it will validate that that field is technically a valid URL. Another element that we have is type equals tell. Now on the desktop, this will not be very useful. However, on a phone, it will launch a keypad so that the user can very easily key in a number into that text area. So here we have some different types, and essentially what they do for the phones is that they will also, in addition to possibly validating on the desktop, they will also launch a custom keypad. So here we see type equals email will launch the keypad that has the @ sign. Type equals search will launch the keypad with a search button. Type equals tell launches the numeric keypad. Type equals URL will launch the keypad with the .com on it. They also validate that that data is correct. In addition to validating things such as emails, addresses, and URLs, we can specify our own pattern. So for example, if the information had to be alphanumeric or just numeric, we could do that using the pattern attribute. And here that is set to a pattern that would be determined by a technology referred to as regular expressions, and there is a lot of information on that on the internet. Another new HTML5 element is the date. We can now have the user choose a date from the calendar simply by adding type equals date into our input element. Another new HTML5 element, type equals color. Here again, it will launch the color picker for us. Another new HTML5 element, type equals range, which will configure this type of slider control so that we can choose a number. And here again, we can specify our custom range. All right, what do we do for backward compatibility? Well, there is a JavaScript library that will satisfy those requirements for browsers that do not understand HTML5. However, for many of these controls, for example, type equals email, type equals tell, type equals URL, should we not have this library installed, the browser will just render that element as a pure text box. So here again, it would just look like a text box. The user can type something in and nothing is broken. However, there are ways of imposing backward compatibility for that. All right, one very nice new CSS3 pseudo-class is the focus pseudo-class. So when the user clicks into a text field that is called giving focus to it, we can call a CSS style. Similar to the hover, when the mouse goes over something, we can have a certain style coming into play. Well, we can do the same thing when we go from one text box to another, and that is focus. That is a pseudo-class. There are three other very interesting pseudo-classes. One is the required pseudo-class. We did talk about this concept of required fields. So you could automatically style every required field, either by maybe putting an image next to it, like an asterisk. I mean, you could manually do that, but now we can do this with CSS. We can make the boxes around them red or something, which is what they're doing here in this location. Now, if the user does enter a response that is invalid, such as an email or a URL, we have the invalid pseudo-class, so that not only will we give them an error message, but we can style that form element in a specific style. So here again, once they fix that, we can style it back using the valid pseudo-class. Styling CSS forms is relatively easy. And here again, labels should be used. Every form element should have a label for purposes of accessibility. They also give us a very easy way to style. What we can do, rather than use a table, which is deprecated in HTML5 for page layout, we can, by using floats and the display property, we can lay out our form elements quite easily. By the way, if you recall, all form elements are inline elements, meaning they all go across the page. They are not by default block level elements. So in order to float them, we need to set them to the display property to block. Alright, so notice on the left hand side we will be setting our labels to display a block, and you should do that to the text boxes, although that's not necessarily required. In order to float the text boxes, the label would have a display a block. It would also have a float left on it. Here again, we would put widths to line up the columns, and possibly some other margins or paddings, whatever. So by setting the floats and the block display to the label, the text boxes will automatically wrap up next to them, and then we can clear that float later on in that label so the next row lines up. Should we wish to not have a label, for example, for the submit button, as it's not required, all we need to do is move that margin over. There's a lot of information on the internet about styling forms with CSS.